There is a boundary that can completely transform the dynamic between you and someone who has become accustomed to your pursuit. And it is not a complicated sentence. It is not a psychological trick. It is not disappearing for 7 days, posting pictures to make someone jealous, or pretending you do not care. The boundary is much deeper than that. I will not chase what is unwilling to choose me. Think about what happens when you constantly pursue someone who keeps pulling away. They become distant and you move closer. They become uncertain and you provide reassurance. They stop communicating and you send another message. They withdraw emotionally and you begin explaining yourself, proving your value, trying to repair something you did not break. Eventually, without realizing it, you create a pattern. Their distance produces your pursuit. Your pursuit gives them relief from the pressure of intimacy. They pull away again and you chase again. That cycle can become so familiar that both people mistake it for the relationship itself. But it is not intimacy. It is a pattern of regulation. One person creates distance to feel safe, while the other creates closeness to feel secure. And the more intensely each person responds to their own discomfort, the stronger the cycle becomes. This is why the boundary matters. When you stop chasing, you are not abandoning love. You are abandoning the belief that love must be earned through relentless effort. There is a profound philosophical difference between pursuing someone and choosing someone. Pursuit says, I need to convince you. Choice says, I know what I bring and I'm willing to meet you where mutual effort exists. That distinction changes everything. Because when you stop trying to force emotional availability out of another person, you return responsibility to where it belongs. You cannot make someone communicate. You cannot make someone become emotionally ready. You cannot love someone hard enough to eliminate their fear of intimacy. You can offer honesty, patience, compassion, and consistency, but you cannot do their emotional work for them. And this is where your boundary becomes powerful. You are saying through your behavior, I care about you, but I will not abandon myself to keep you. That is not arrogance. That is self-respect. And self-respect is different from ego. Ego says, you must choose me because I deserve you. Self-respect says, if you don't choose me, I will still choose myself. That second position is extraordinarily powerful because your identity is no longer dependent on another person's response. You stop checking your phone every 5 minutes. You stop interpreting every silence. You stop asking yourself what you did wrong. You stop constructing elaborate theories about why someone suddenly became distant. You stop turning another person's emotional limitations into a verdict on your own worth. Instead, you observe. You listen. You allow behavior to speak. If they want connection, they have the opportunity to move towards you. If they need space, you respect it. If they return with genuine effort, you evaluate that effort. And if they continue giving you inconsistency, you do not keep standing at the door begging to be let inside. That is the boundary. And here's the paradox. The less you try to control whether someone chooses you, the more clearly you discover whether they actually want to. Because pressure can create temporary compliance, but freedom reveals genuine intention. Someone who comes closer only when you chase them is responding to pursuit. Someone who consistently comes closer when you stop chasing is demonstrating choice. There is an important distinction here. This is not about using silence as manipulation. It is not about withholding affection to trigger someone's fear of losing you. It is not about calculating exactly how long to wait before responding to a message. Those are still forms of control. A genuine boundary does not ask, how can I make them miss me? It asks, what behavior am I willing to participate in? That question puts the power back in your hands. You are no longer managing their emotions. You are managing your standards. And when your standards become clear, your relationships become clearer too. You begin to understand that love is not measured by how much anxiety you can tolerate. It is measured by the quality of connection two people are willing to build together. So if someone pulls away, let them have the space they are asking for. Do not punish them. Do not chase them. Do not collapse emotionally. Continue living. Continue growing. Continue becoming the person you were meant to become. Because your life cannot be placed on hold while someone decides whether they are ready to participate in it. The moment you stop chasing someone who refuses to choose you, you discover the most important choice of all. You can choose yourself without closing your heart. Now, once you understand that you cannot chase someone into choosing you, the next question becomes even more important. What happens when they pull away? Because this is where most people lose their power. Someone becomes distant and suddenly their entire emotional world revolves around closing that distance. They send another message. They ask, "Are you okay?" They explain what they meant. They apologize for things they did not do. They offer reassurance. They become more available. They give more attention. And underneath all of it is one unconscious message. If I give you enough, maybe you will come back. But psychologically, there is a problem with that pattern. When distance consistently produces increased attention, distance can become reinforced. You may not intend to teach that lesson, but behavior does not care about intention. Behavior learns from consequences. If every withdrawal is followed by greater pursuit, then the withdrawal itself may become part of the relationship's rhythm. This does not mean an avoidant person is consciously manipulating you. That would be an oversimplification. People often act from learned emotional patterns rather than deliberate strategy. Someone who feels overwhelmed by intimacy may instinctively create distance to regulate themselves. But if the other person responds by chasing harder, both individuals can become trapped in a cycle neither consciously designed. One person withdraws, the other pursues. The withdrawal creates anxiety. The anxiety creates more pursuit. The pursuit creates more pressure. The pressure creates more withdrawal. And suddenly, two people who may genuinely care about each other are behaving in ways that make connection increasingly difficult. So the boundary is not, "I will make you suffer because you pulled away." The boundary is, "I will not reward emotional distance with unlimited access to my attention." That is a completely different mindset. You are not punishing someone. You are refusing to participate in a pattern that destroys your peace. And there is something psychologically profound about that decision. When you stop immediately reacting to another person's withdrawal, you create space between stimulus and response. They pull away and you breathe. They become quiet and you continue your day. They need space and you allow them to have it without abandoning yourself. That space is where emotional maturity develops. Because your first impulse is not always your wisest impulse. Anxiety says, "Fix this immediately." Self-respect says, "Let me understand what is actually happening." Fear says, "If I don't do something right now, I might lose them." Wisdom says, "If this connection depends on me constantly preventing their departure, then I need to understand what kind of connection this really is." That is a powerful shift. You stop responding to fear and start responding to reality. And reality is often much simpler than the stories we create in our minds. Someone who needs temporary space may eventually return with communication and consistency. Someone who is uncertain may eventually clarify their intentions. Someone who genuinely wants a relationship will have opportunities to demonstrate that desire through action. And someone who repeatedly disappears without consideration may be showing you something important about their current capacity for connection. Your responsibility is not to force the outcome. Your responsibility is to pay attention. This is where boundaries become an expression of self-worth rather than a relationship tactic. A boundary says, "My attention is valuable." A boundary says, "My emotional energy has limits." A boundary says, "I am willing to communicate, but I am not willing to chase someone indefinitely." And notice what happens when you adopt that mindset. You become calmer. You do not need to monitor their social media. You do not need to decode every word. You do not need to send carefully calculated messages. You do not need to manufacture jealousy. You do not need to disappear strategically. You simply stop overfunctioning in a relationship where the other person is underfunctioning. That is the difference between emotional strategy and emotional strength. Strategy asks, "What can I do to get the reaction I want?" Strength asks, "What behavior allows me to remain aligned with who I am?" And that second question is the one that changes your life. Because eventually every relationship reveals a fundamental truth. You cannot create mutuality by yourself. You can create opportunities for connection. You can communicate honestly. You can become more secure in yourself. You can make your expectations clear, but you cannot carry another person's half of the relationship indefinitely. At some point, they have to walk toward you. And when you stop rewarding distance with excessive attention, you create a healthier environment for that choice to happen. If they want connection, they have room to move toward it. If they need space, they can have it. And if they choose not to return, painful as that may be, you have gained something equally valuable, clarity. Because clarity is better than emotional addiction disguised as hope. You do not need someone to miss you desperately. You need someone who is willing to meet you consistently. You do not need someone to fear losing you. You need someone who understands the value of keeping you. So the next time someone pulls away, resist the instinct to chase. Pause, breathe, return to yourself. Let their behavior belong to them, and let your standards belong to you. Never make someone's distance the reason you abandon yourself. And once you stop rewarding distance with excessive attention, you arrive at an even deeper principle. Giving someone space does not mean abandoning yourself. This is where people often misunderstand boundaries. They think a boundary means becoming cold. They think it means withdrawing affection, ignoring messages, or deliberately creating emotional scarcity. But a genuine boundary is not a wall. It is a line that defines where your responsibility ends and another person's responsibility begins. If someone needs space, you can respect that, but respecting their space does not require you to put your life on pause. That distinction is incredibly important. Imagine someone tells you, I need some time to think. You can respond with maturity, I understand, take the space you need. When you're ready to communicate, I'm open to having that conversation. And then you live your life. You do not spend the next 3 days staring at your phone. You do not repeatedly ask whether they are okay. You do not send emotional paragraphs trying to convince them that the relationship is worth saving. You do not interpret their need for space as evidence that you are unlovable. You allow them to regulate themselves while you regulate yourself. That is emotional maturity. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes what we call love is actually an inability to tolerate uncertainty. We say, I just care so much. But sometimes underneath that statement is, I cannot tolerate not knowing what you are thinking. And when uncertainty becomes unbearable, we try to eliminate it by pursuing the other person. We ask more questions. We demand reassurance. We seek immediate answers. We try to force clarity before the other person is ready to provide it. But pressure rarely creates genuine emotional openness. You cannot force someone to become vulnerable by demanding vulnerability. You cannot create safety by making someone feel trapped. And you cannot build intimacy by constantly trying to control another person's emotional timing. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is give someone enough room to hear their own thoughts. But there is an equally important second half to that principle. While they are listening to themselves, you must continue listening to yourself. What do you need? What kind of communication makes you feel respected? How long are you genuinely willing to remain in uncertainty? What behavior can you accept temporarily? And what behavior crosses the line? Those questions matter because boundaries without self-awareness are just rules. A meaningful boundary comes from knowing your values. Suppose someone occasionally needs a night alone. That may be completely reasonable, but suppose someone repeatedly disappears for weeks, refuses communication, returns whenever they want attention, and expects you to immediately resume the relationship as if nothing happened. At that point, the issue is no longer simply their need for space. The issue is whether the relationship can meet your fundamental needs, and you do not have to condemn them to acknowledge that. This is one of the most powerful forms of emotional intelligence, being able to say, I understand why you behave this way, and I also understand that this behavior may not work for me. Compassion does not require self-sacrifice. Understanding does not require tolerance of everything. And love does not require you to betray your own standards. You can have empathy for someone's fear of intimacy without making their fear the operating system of your entire relationship. You can understand why they withdraw without chasing them every time they do. You can care deeply about them without becoming responsible for regulating their emotions. That is what secure emotional behavior looks like. You remain open without becoming desperate. You remain caring without becoming consumed. You remain available without becoming endlessly accessible. And paradoxically, this creates a very different emotional environment for an avoidant person. Why? Because there is less pressure. When you stop chasing, they are no longer responding to your anxiety. When you stop demanding immediate reassurance, they have more room to approach connection voluntarily. When you stop making their withdrawal an emotional emergency, the relationship becomes less reactive. But remember, this is not a manipulation technique designed to make someone fall in love. That mindset misses the entire point. The goal is not to create the perfect conditions for someone else to choose you. The goal is to create the conditions in which you no longer abandon yourself while waiting to be chosen. That is the real transformation. You become comfortable with space because you know who you are inside that space. You discover that their silence cannot erase your identity. Their uncertainty cannot determine your value. Their hesitation cannot stop your life. Their emotional limitations cannot become your emotional prison. And when you reach that level of internal stability, something remarkable happens. You stop fearing space. You start using space wisely. You allow the other person to move toward you because you are no longer running toward them. You let actions reveal intentions. You let consistency build trust. You let time expose patterns. And you let reality, not fantasy, tell you what the relationship actually is. So give them space when space is genuinely needed. But never confuse giving someone space with giving away your self-respect. Let them have the room to find themselves, but never lose yourself while waiting for them to return. And once you learn how to give someone space without abandoning yourself, you discover the next principle. Emotional access should be built through consistency, not granted simply because someone returns. This is where many people get trapped. Someone disappears. They become distant. Communication becomes inconsistent. Then suddenly they come back. Maybe they send a casual message. Hey, how have you been? Maybe they act as if nothing happened. Maybe they become warm again, affectionate again, interested again. And because you have been waiting for that moment, your entire emotional system lights up. You feel relief. You think, finally, they're back. So you immediately give them everything they had before. Your attention returns, your availability returns, your emotional investment returns, your trust returns. But here's the question you have to ask yourself. Did anything actually change? Because someone's return is not necessarily evidence of transformation. Sometimes people return because they miss the comfort you provided. Sometimes they return because loneliness has become uncomfortable. Sometimes they return because they want reassurance that you are still available. And sometimes they return because they have genuinely reflected, grown, and decided they want to build something healthier. Those situations may look identical in the beginning. The difference is what happens afterward. That is why consistency matters more than intensity. Anybody can be intensely affectionate for a few days. Anybody can say, I miss you. Anybody can promise, I'll do better. But can they communicate consistently when intimacy becomes uncomfortable? Can they remain present when conflict appears? Can they express their needs instead of disappearing? Can they take responsibility when their behavior hurts you? Can they respect your boundaries even when they do not like them? Those are the questions that reveal emotional maturity. You see, words communicate intention, but patterns communicate capacity. And if you want to build a healthy relationship with someone who tends to withdraw, you cannot make promises the currency of the relationship. You need behavior to become the currency. That does not mean becoming suspicious or testing them constantly. It means becoming observant. You don't need to interrogate someone about whether they have changed. You simply watch. You allow time to provide evidence. If they say they want more communication, watch whether communication actually becomes more consistent. If they say they want commitment, watch whether their decisions reflect commitment. If they apologize for withdrawing, watch whether they develop healthier ways to handle emotional discomfort. This is not about demanding perfection. Everyone makes mistakes. The real question is whether the person is capable of correction. There is an enormous difference between someone who makes a mistake and someone who repeatedly makes the same mistake while expecting forgiveness to erase the consequences. Healthy relationships are not built by pretending nothing happened. They are built by learning from what happened. And this is where your boundary becomes incredibly powerful. You do not have to say, you hurt me, so now I will punish you. You can say, I am willing to reconnect, but trust will be rebuilt through consistency. That sentence changes the entire emotional framework because now access is no longer automatic. It is not a reward for returning. It is something that grows as reliability grows. And that is not manipulation. That is simply the natural architecture of trust. Think about trust in any area of life. If someone repeatedly promises to show up and repeatedly does not, you do not restore complete confidence simply because they apologize one more time. You watch what happens next. Relationships deserve the same standard. And this is particularly important when dealing with hot and cold dynamics because inconsistency can create a powerful emotional illusion. The highs feel extraordinary because they come after lows. The reunion feels more intense because you are afraid of losing the person. The affection feels deeper because you experience deprivation. But intensity is not always intimacy. Sometimes intensity is simply the emotional contrast created by instability. Real intimacy often feels quieter. It feels predictable. It feels safe enough that you do not have to constantly wonder where you stand. And that is why your boundary should not be never let them come back. It should be, if you come back differently. Come back with communication. Come back with accountability. Come back with consistency. Come back prepared to participate. Because you are not asking them to become somebody else. You are asking whether the relationship can become something healthier. And there is another powerful psychological shift here. When you stop immediately rewarding inconsistent behavior, you stop confusing access with commitment. Someone can have access to you and still not be committed to you. Someone can miss you and still be unable to maintain a healthy relationship. Someone can love you and still lack the emotional skills necessary to love you well. Those distinctions matter because your goal is not merely to be loved. Your goal is to experience love that is sustainable. So if someone returns, don't rush to decide what their return means. Observe what they do with the opportunity. Give them room to demonstrate their intentions. Let consistency accumulate. Let trust be earned naturally. And remember, the strongest boundary is not "you must never hurt me." That is impossible. The stronger boundary is, if something hurts the relationship, we will address it. And what happens next will be determined by behavior, not promises. Because when you stop rewarding temporary affection and start valuing consistent effort, you stop asking, do they love me? You start asking the question that matters far more. Can their love actually sustain the relationship? And that question can save you years of confusion. Don't reward someone's return with your full trust. Let their consistency earn it. And once you understand that consistency is the price of emotional access, you reach another boundary that can completely change the way you experience an avoidant relationship. You become unavailable for the hot and cold cycle. Because there is something psychologically addictive about inconsistency. When someone is warm one day and distant the next, your mind starts searching for explanations. You begin analyzing messages, timing, tone, social media activity, and tiny changes in behavior. You don't simply experience the relationship anymore, you monitor it. And that is where emotional freedom begins to disappear. You start asking, what happened? Did I say something wrong? Why were they so affectionate yesterday and so cold today? Should I give them space? Should I text first? Maybe they are scared. Or maybe they secretly care. The mind hates uncertainty. When something matters to us but remains unpredictable, we become increasingly focused on obtaining certainty. That is why hot and cold behavior can feel so intense. The moments of closeness become disproportionately valuable because they arrive after periods of uncertainty. A loving message after silence feels enormous. A sudden reunion after withdrawal feels extraordinary. A little affection can feel like proof that everything is finally changing. But you have to be careful. Intensity is not necessarily intimacy. Sometimes what feels like passion is simply the emotional contrast created by instability. When something is consistently available, you may appreciate it quietly. When it repeatedly disappears, every return feels like a victory, and that can create a dangerous psychological loop. Distance creates anxiety. Anxiety creates pursuit. Pursuit creates temporary closeness. Closeness creates relief. Then distance returns, and the cycle begins again. If you remain inside that cycle long enough, you can become more attached to the relief than to the actual relationship. That is why the boundary matters. You are saying, I am not available for a relationship where emotional security depends on constantly guessing what happens next. Notice what this boundary does not say. It does not say, you must communicate exactly the way I want. It does not say, you are never allowed to need space. It does not say, if you pull away once, I'm leaving forever. Instead, it says, I can understand your need for space, but I cannot build a healthy relationship around repeated uncertainty. That is reasonable. People need different amounts of solitude. People process emotions differently. Someone may genuinely need time before discussing something difficult. The issue is not space. The issue is instability without accountability. There is a difference between saying, I need a little time to process this, I'll reach out tomorrow, and disappearing without explanation whenever emotional closeness becomes uncomfortable. One demonstrates self-awareness. The other creates confusion, and you should not have to become a detective to understand the person you are trying to love. This is where your own behavior becomes critical. When the hot and cold cycle begins, do not chase the warmth. Do not panic during the coldness. Do not try to manufacture the next high. Return to your center. Ask yourself, what is the pattern? Not, what happened today? The pattern tells you far more than any individual moment. Someone may have an off day. Someone may become overwhelmed. Someone may communicate poorly once. That does not define an entire relationship. But repeated inconsistency is information. And mature people learn to treat information as information rather than turning it into a personal insult. If someone repeatedly withdraws, you don't need to call them a bad person. You simply recognize that their current behavior is not compatible with what you need. That is an enormous psychological upgrade. You stop judging their character and start evaluating compatibility. You stop asking, how do I make them change? You start asking, is this relationship capable of becoming healthy? That question puts you back in control of your life, because you cannot control whether someone becomes emotionally available. You can control whether you continue participating in a pattern that repeatedly damages your peace. And this is where many people discover something surprising. When they stop reacting to every emotional fluctuation, they become more attractive. Not because they are playing hard to get, but because they are no longer communicating desperation. Their energy becomes grounded. Their attention becomes intentional. Their life becomes larger than the relationship. They can love deeply without becoming emotionally dependent. They can say, I miss you, without saying, I cannot function without you. They can care without chasing. They can be vulnerable without surrendering their standards. That is emotional strength. And if an avoidant person genuinely wants to build a relationship with you, that strength gives them something healthier to respond to. They are no longer being pursued by someone who is terrified of losing them. They are encountering someone who is capable of connection, but also capable of walking away from dysfunction. That distinction matters, because commitment becomes meaningful only when both people are free to choose it. If someone stays because you constantly prevent them from leaving, that is not secure love. If someone stays because they genuinely recognize your value and willingly participate in the relationship, that is something entirely different. So stop measuring love by how intensely someone reacts to your absence. Measure it by how consistently they show up in your presence. Stop celebrating every return as proof of commitment. Look for sustained behavior. Stop asking whether they secretly care. Ask whether they are capable of caring in a way that creates emotional safety. And above all, stop allowing unpredictable behavior to become the emotional rhythm of your life. You deserve a relationship where peace does not feel suspicious. You deserve a connection where affection does not have to be earned after every withdrawal. You deserve consistency, not because you are demanding perfection, but because healthy love requires participation from both people. So when the hot and cold cycle begins, don't chase the next warm moment. Step back, observe, protect your peace, and let the pattern reveal the truth. Never confuse emotional intensity with emotional intimacy. Choose the love that brings you peace, not the chaos that keeps you waiting. And now we arrive at the deepest boundary of all, because everything we have discussed ultimately leads back to one decision. You must choose yourself so completely that love becomes a choice, not a need. That does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean convincing yourself that you don't care. It does not mean pretending you are independent because you are afraid of being vulnerable. Real independence is not the absence of love. It is the ability to love without abandoning yourself. There is a profound difference between saying, I want you, and saying, I need you to be okay. The first comes from desire. The second comes from dependence. And when you make another person's attention responsible for your emotional stability, you hand them far more power than any relationship should contain. Think about what happens when you need someone to choose you. Every delayed message becomes threatening. Every change in tone becomes meaningful. Every moment of distance becomes evidence that something is wrong. You begin negotiating against yourself. You tolerate things you once said you would never tolerate. You accept inconsistency because you are afraid consistency may never come. You silence your needs because expressing them might push the other person away. And eventually, you are no longer asking, is this relationship good for me? You are asking, what must I become so they won't leave? That is the wrong question. The better question is, who do I need to become so that I never abandon myself again? That question changes everything. Because when you genuinely choose yourself, you stop treating another person's decision as a referendum on your worth. If they choose you, beautiful. If they need time, you can respect that. If they cannot offer the relationship you need, you can accept that reality without destroying yourself. Your heart can be disappointed without your identity collapsing. That is emotional freedom. And paradoxically, this is also where healthier love becomes possible. Because people are naturally drawn towards someone who has an internal center. Someone who has a life, values, purpose, boundaries, friendships, ambitions, and standards beyond the relationship. Not because independence is a trick, not because you should become unavailable to make someone chase you, but because genuine self-respect changes the quality of your presence. You no longer enter relationships asking, what can you give me so I can feel secure? You enter asking, what can we build together? That is an entirely different psychological position. You become a partner rather than a pursuer. You participate rather than plead. You communicate rather than manipulate. You observe rather than obsess. And this is especially important when dealing with someone who tends to withdraw emotionally. If your entire sense of security depends on their closeness, their withdrawal will control your emotional state. But when your foundation is inside you, their withdrawal becomes information, not destruction. You can say, I care about this person, but I will not lose myself trying to keep them close. That sentence contains enormous strength because love should expand your life, not shrink it. It should challenge you to grow, not require you to disappear. It should create vulnerability, not erase your boundaries. And choosing yourself means